June 17, 1944, Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The setting sun cast long shadows across the hastily constructed prisoner of war compound as 500 German soldiers stood in formation, their sunken eyes and hollow cheeks testifying to weeks of inadequate rations and the long journey across the Atlantic. Hauptmann Werner Müller, formerly of the 352nd Infantry Division captured at Normandy, straightened his back despite the gnawing pain in his stomach. He had assured his men that American captivity would be harsh but survivable, a necessary endurance until the inevitable German victory and their subsequent release. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these proud Wehrmacht soldiers would experience over the next 24 hours would not only fill their empty stomachs, but begin to unravel everything they had been taught to believe about America, the war, and their own country's prospects. The convoy of army trucks had deposited the German prisoners at Fort Campbell's newly constructed Camp B just after 1600 hours. The camp, designed to hold up to 2,000 prisoners, was one of hundreds being hastily established across America, as the Allied advance in Europe yielded tens of thousands of German captives. Military Police Sergeant Frank Donovan, a 32-year-old former high school teacher from Rochester, New York, watched the Germans disembark with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Having studied German in college, Donovan had been assigned as liaison officer for this group. "They look half-starved," Donovan remarked to Captain James Wilson, the camp commander. Wilson nodded. "Intelligence says they've been on reduced rations for months. The Wehrmacht's supply lines are stretched thin. Most of these men were captured 12 days ago and have been on transport ships and trains ever since." Donovan observed the Germans forming neat rows despite their exhaustion. Even in defeat, their discipline remained intact. "Their uniforms are in tatters, but look at that formation. Perfect lines." "German efficiency," Wilson said with a hint of grudging respect. "Let's get them processed and fed. Standard protocol, delousing, medical check, fresh uniforms, and then mess hall." Hauptmann Müller stood at attention as an American officer approached. His men were exhausted, but he had insisted on military bearing. Anything less would dishonor the Wehrmacht. The Americans might have captured their bodies, but not their spirit. Müller had been a history teacher in Munich before the war. At 36, he was older than most of his men and felt responsible for them beyond military obligation. Hauptmann Werner Müller, 352nd Infantry Division, service number 3872591, he stated in accented English before the American could speak. Sergeant Donovan replied in German, "Welcome to Camp B, Hauptmann Müller. I'm Sergeant Frank Donovan, your liaison officer. We'll begin processing your men immediately. They'll receive medical attention, new clothing and food." Müller's face remained impassive. "My men require only what the Geneva Convention stipulates. We expect no special treatment." Donovan switched back to English. "This isn't special treatment, Captain. It's standard procedure for all POWs in American custody." Obergefreiter Karl Schmidt, a 20-year-old former baker's apprentice from Hamburg, stood behind Müller, swaying slightly from hunger and fatigue. Schmidt had been conscripted in 1942 and served 2 years on the Eastern Front before being transferred to France just months before D-Day. The horrors he had witnessed in Russia had hardened him, but nothing had prepared him for the humiliation of capture. Schmidt leaned toward Feldwebel Heinrich Wagner, a career soldier with 14 years of service. "The Americans will try to break us with their so-called generosity," he whispered. "Goebbels warned us about this." Wagner, a 34-year-old veteran who had fought in Poland, France and Russia, nodded imperceptibly. "Stay strong. Remember your oath to the Führer." The Germans were directed to processing tents, where they surrendered their few remaining personal items, were dusted with DDT powder, showered and issued new clothing. Olive drab trousers and shirts with PW stenciled in white on the back. The efficiency of the operation surprised many of the Germans who had expected disorganization from the Americans. Dr. Martin Collins, a 41-year-old army physician from Philadelphia, supervised the medical examinations. "These men are suffering from various stages of malnutrition," he reported to Captain Wilson. "I'm seeing vitamin deficiencies, muscle atrophy, and cases of trench foot that haven't been properly treated. 3 have shrapnel wounds that need immediate attention. Most are carrying intestinal parasites." "Give them whatever treatment they need," Wilson ordered. "Once they're cleared, send them to the mess hall in groups of 50. By 1900 hours, the first group of prisoners entered the camp mess hall. American kitchen staff had prepared a simple but substantial meal: beef stew with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread with butter, canned peaches, and coffee with sugar and powdered milk. Carl Schmidt stared at the heaping tray placed before him. The portion was larger than what he had received for an entire day in the Wehrmacht during the past months. He glanced at Feldwebel Wagner, unsure whether to eat. Wagner frowned. "It could be a trick. Perhaps they'll photograph us eating like pigs for propaganda." Hauptmann Müller, seated at the end of the table, picked up his spoon. "We will eat with dignity. We require sustenance to maintain our strength." His words gave permission, but the men still hesitated. Nearby, PFC Robert Johnson, a 19-year-old from Georgia assigned to mess hall duty, watched the Germans' reaction. "What's wrong with them? Why aren't they eating?" Sergeant Donovan, overseeing the meal, explained, "They're suspicious. German propaganda told them we'd mistreat them or use them for public humiliation." Johnson shook his head in disbelief. "My mama would tan my hide if I let food like that get cold. We've got farm boys back home who'd give their right arm for a meal this good, and we're serving it to the enemy." "That's the difference between us and them, Johnson," Donovan replied. "We follow the Geneva Convention. Besides, well-fed prisoners cause fewer problems." After several minutes of hesitation, hunger overcame suspicion. The sound of spoons against trays filled the mess hall. Some of the younger Germans couldn't maintain their restraint, devouring the food rapidly, despite efforts to appear disciplined. Carl Schmidt couldn't remember the last time he had tasted beef. In the final months before capture, his unit had subsisted on turnips, old bread, and occasional horse meat. He forced himself to eat slowly, savoring each bite, fighting the urge to lick the tray clean. Private Josef Bauer, at just 18, the youngest soldier in Müller's company, failed to contain his emotion. Tears streamed down his face as he ate. "It's like my mother's stew," he whispered to Schmidt. "Control yourself," Wagner hissed at Bauer. "Remember who you are." Müller observed his men while methodically eating his own portion. The Americans had served them using the same metal trays and utensils that their own soldiers used. The food was simple but nutritious and plentiful. It contradicted everything Goebbels's propaganda had told them about American shortages and imminent economic collapse. By 2100 hours, all 500 prisoners had been fed. Some had asked for and received second helpings. Captain Wilson conferred with his mess sergeant, Michael O'Malley, a 38-year-old former restaurant owner from Boston. "What's tomorrow's breakfast menu, Sergeant?" O'Malley consulted his clipboard. "Standard Army breakfast, sir. Pancakes with syrup, powdered eggs, bacon, coffee, and reconstituted orange juice. We have enough for all prisoners plus seconds." Wilson nodded. "Serve it according to schedule. I want these men to understand what they're up against. It's not just our fighting capacity, it's our production capacity. Let them see America's abundance up close." In the prisoner barracks, the Germans prepared for their first night in captivity. The facilities were basic, but clean. Wooden bunks with mattresses, pillows, and wool blankets. For many, it was more comfortable than what they'd had on the front lines. Hauptmann Müller gathered his officers for a quiet conference. "Maintain discipline. The Americans want to impress us with their resources. Remember your training." Lieutenant Otto Richter, a 25-year-old officer who had studied engineering before the war, spoke hesitantly. Herr Hauptmann, the food quantity was unexpected. We were told Americans faced severe rationing. Müller's expression hardened. One meal proves nothing. Their generosity has limits. When winter comes, or their supply lines are stretched, conditions will deteriorate. The Reich will prevail. This is merely a temporary setback. But doubt had been planted. Richter had seen the American trucks, weapons and equipment up close during the fighting in Normandy. The quality and quantity had shocked him. Now, the abundance of food reinforced what he had observed in combat. America's industrial might was not, as Goebbels claimed, an illusion. In another corner of the barracks, Carl Schmidt sat on his bunk, writing in a small notebook he had been allowed to keep. He documented the day's events with precision, noting the calories and nutritional content of the meal based on his baker's training. Schmidt calculated that the dinner alone contained more protein than he had received in an entire week before capture. Feldwebel Wagner approached and glanced at Schmidt's notes. "Be careful what you write. The Americans will read it." Schmidt nodded, but continued writing. "I'm only recording facts, Feldwebel, food quantities and components, for my memory." "Facts can be dangerous," Wagner replied, "especially when they contradict what we've been told." Across the compound, Sergeant Donovan reported to Captain Wilson. "The prisoners are settling in, sir. No incidents. They seemed surprised by the food." Wilson lit a cigarette. "That's the point, Sergeant. The Geneva Convention requires adequate food, but adequate is relative. For men who've been on starvation rations, a standard army chow might as well be a feast at the Waldorf. Some of them could barely eat, sir. Their stomachs have shrunk from malnutrition. Dr. Collins is aware. We'll monitor their intake and adjust as needed. These men are no use to us, sick or dead. When the war ends, they'll return to Germany. What they've seen and experienced here will matter." Dawn broke at 05:45 hours. The prisoners were roused by American guards and directed to washing facilities, sinks with running hot and cold water, shower stalls, and flush toilets. Again, the contrast with their recent military experience was stark. Even before the invasion, water had been rationed. Many hadn't had a hot shower in months. Hauptmann Müller performed his ablutions methodically, observing the Americans through careful sidelong glances. The guards were relaxed but vigilant, well-fed and well-equipped. Their uniforms were clean and of good quality. It was another data point that contradicted what he had been told about American supply problems. At 0700 hours, the prisoners were escorted to the mess hall for breakfast. The smell of bacon, coffee, and pancakes filled the air. The Germans formed an orderly line, moving with less hesitation than the previous evening. Carl Schmidt stared at his breakfast tray in disbelief. "Speck? Real coffee with sugar?" The pancakes were topped with butter and maple syrup, luxuries unimaginable in wartime Germany. Joseph Bauer, the young private, couldn't contain himself. "I haven't had meat for breakfast since 1939, he whispered, biting into a piece of bacon with an expression of pure joy. Feldwebel Wagner ate silently, his face unreadable. But Hauptmann Müller noticed the veteran soldier's hands trembling slightly as he cut his pancakes into precise squares. At a nearby table, Lieutenant Richter engaged in conversation with other officers. "The Americans must be trying to impress us," one suggested. "This can't be their standard ration." Richter had reached a different conclusion. "I watched the guards' trays. They're eating exactly what we are." From his observation post, Sergeant Donovan noted the change in the prisoner's demeanor. The rigid formality was beginning to crack. Conversations grew louder. Some even smiled as they ate. Captain Wilson entered the mess hall with Colonel Thomas Bradford, the regional POW camp supervisor, on an inspection tour. Bradford, a 52-year-old regular army officer with 30 years of service, had fought in the First World War and understood the psychological impact of current events. "The food meets regulations, Colonel," Wilson reported. "Standard army rations, the same our troops receive, adjusted only for religious or medical restrictions." Bradford nodded. "The Geneva Convention requires we feed them the same as our own base troops, but for these men, it's doing more than filling stomachs. It's opening eyes." "Statistical warfare, sir." "Precisely, Captain. Each pancake is worth 1,000 propaganda leaflets. By noon, every man here will be calculating America's food production capacity. By evening, they'll be rethinking everything they've been told about our resources." After breakfast, the prisoners were assigned to temporary work details, cleaning the compound, organizing supplies, and basic maintenance tasks as allowed under the Geneva Convention. The work was not demanding, but it gave the men purpose and prevented the demoralization of idleness. Hauptmann Müller was granted permission to hold a meeting with his officers. In the privacy of a small office, he addressed their growing concerns. "The Americans are attempting to influence us through their abundance," he stated firmly. "This is a psychological operation, nothing more." Lieutenant Richter dared to disagree. "With respect, Herr Hauptmann, if this is their standard, what does it say about Germany's situation? My men are already making comparisons." Another officer, Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber, a 29-year-old from Berlin, added, "The Americans are providing this food to over 500 unexpected prisoners without apparent strain. Their logistics capability is concerning." Müller's face flushed. "You forget yourselves. We are soldiers of the Reich. Temporary comfort must not cloud your judgment." "I've commanded supply operations, Herr Hauptmann," Weber continued carefully. "To feed 500 additional men without preparation requires significant reserves. When I requested additional rations for my company in Normandy, I was told none were available. The difference is stark." At midday, the prisoners returned to the mess hall for lunch. The meal consisted of ham sandwiches on fresh bread, potato salad, apple slices, and lemonade. Again, the portions were generous, the quality high by wartime standards. Karl Schmidt sat with Josef Bauer and several other enlisted men. 3 meals in less than 24 hours, Schmidt marveled. "More food than we saw in a week." Bauer lowered his voice. "My cousin works at the Volkswagen factory. Last winter they reduced the worker rations again. He fainted twice at his station. They told them it was temporary, that America was facing food riots and would soon surrender from internal pressure." A corporal named Dieter Hoffmann joined the conversation. "My brother wrote from Hamburg that civilians were getting 0 calories daily at most. Here, just this sandwich must be 500 calories. Schmidt made calculations in his notebook. "Based on my estimates, we've consumed approximately 200 calories since yesterday evening. That's more than twice what we received on the front lines, and almost 4 times German civilian rations." Feldwebel Wagner approached their table. "Watch your conversations," he warned. "Defeatist talk is still punishable, even here." Hoffmann stared at his plate. "Is stating facts defeatist, Feldwebel, or is denying them more dangerous?" Wagner had no answer. Across the camp, Dr. Collins monitored the prisoners' health. "They're responding well to the nutrition," he told Captain Wilson. "But we need to be careful. Refeeding syndrome can be dangerous for the severely malnourished." Wilson nodded. "Adjust portions as needed. I want them healthy enough for work details within a week." Sergeant Donovan had been interviewing prisoners, gathering intelligence on German troop movements and morale. "Sir, I'm hearing consistent reports of severe supply problems throughout the Wehrmacht. Some units were down to 1 meal per day before the invasion." "Document everything, Sergeant. This isn't just about these 500 men. It's about understanding the broader situation in the European theatre." By afternoon, rumors circulated among the prisoners. Some claimed the Americans were fattening them up for hard labor. Others suggested the food was a one-time display that wouldn't continue. But as the dinner hour approached, anticipation rather than skepticism dominated conversations. At 1800 hours, the prisoners returned to the mess hall. The evening meal consisted of roast chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, fresh rolls, chocolate pudding, and coffee. The sight of whole chicken portions, protein that had become increasingly rare in Germany, caused a momentary silence as the men filed past the serving line. Carl Schmidt stared at his tray, then at the American kitchen workers cheerfully serving food. How can they spare this for enemies? He wondered aloud. Seated beside him, Josef Bauer had abandoned all pretense of stoicism. "It's the best meal I've ever had," he declared, his young face animated with pleasure. Even Feldwebel Wagner's rigid demeanor had softened. He ate methodically, but with evident enjoyment, cleaning his plate completely. Hauptmann Müller observed his men with growing concern. The transformation was unmistakable. The Americans had achieved with 3 meals what interrogation could not. They had created doubt, not through propaganda or coercion, but through simple abundance. After dinner, Captain Wilson arranged for a selection of books and newspapers to be made available in the barracks. German language materials included classics of literature, technical manuals, and carefully selected news publications that provided accurate but non-inflammatory information about the war's progress. Sergeant Donovan reported new developments to Wilson. "The prisoners are requesting writing material, sir. They want to send letters home. Standard procedure, they're allowed 2 letters and 4 postcards monthly, censored, of course." "Yes, sir. But there's something else. 3 officers have approached me privately, asking about American agricultural production figures. They want statistics." Wilson smiled. "Give them the Department of Agriculture's 1943 annual report, full of numbers. Let them do the math themselves." In the officers' quarters, Müller found Lieutenant Richter studying a well-worn map of Europe he had been allowed to keep. "What occupies your thoughts, Lieutenant?" Müller asked. Richter looked up, his expression troubled. "Distance, Herr Hauptmann, and scale." "Explain." "America is transporting not just troops and equipment across the Atlantic, but enough food to feed its armies, support its allies, and still provide full rations to enemy prisoners. The logistical implications are overwhelming." Müller sat heavily on his bunk. "The Americans are wasteful. This abundance is unsustainable." "With respect, sir, I studied industrial production before the war. If this camp is any indication, America's agricultural output must be enormous. This isn't waste, it's capacity. They can afford to feed us well, because doing so doesn't strain their resources." In the enlisted men's barracks, a heated discussion had developed. Carl Schmidt had been sharing his calculations. "Based on my observations, each prisoner is receiving approximately 3,500 calories daily. Multiplied by 500 prisoners, that's 75 million calories. And this is just one camp of many." Josef Bauer looked troubled. "My sister wrote last year that she stands in line for 6 hours to get bread in Munich. Sometimes the bakery runs out before her turn." Dieter Hoffmann nodded. "My mother mentioned something similar from Cologne. Food cards are being reduced again. They get meat once every 2 weeks, if at all." Feldwebel Wagner, listening nearby, finally spoke. "The Führer explained the temporary sacrifices necessary for final victory. Once we push the Allies back into the sea, conditions will improve." An uncomfortable silence followed. Then Schmidt replied quietly, "The Americans have already moved 30 kilometers inland when I was captured. Their supply lines stretch across an ocean, yet they feed their prisoners better than Germany feeds its workers. What does that tell us about our prospects?" Wagner had no answer. The next morning at breakfast, eggs, sausage, toast with jam and fresh milk, Hauptmann Müller approached Sergeant Donovan with an official request. "My men are required to maintain physical fitness. We request permission for daily exercise and sports activities." Donovan nodded. "Already in the works, Captain. We're setting up a soccer field and volleyball courts. Basic gymnastics equipment will arrive next week." Müller studied the American carefully. "Your German is quite good, Sergeant. Where did you learn it?" "University of Rochester. I taught high school German before the war." This revelation surprised Müller. "You were a teacher, like myself?" "You too? What subject?" "History, at a gymnasium in Munich." A moment of connection passed between the two men, fellow educators now on opposite sides of a global conflict. "What will happen to us, Sergeant?" Müller asked quietly. "Will we remain here for the duration?" "Most likely. Some may be transferred to agricultural work programs if they volunteer. The war won't last forever, Captain." "How can you be so certain?" Donovan gestured toward the mess hall. "Because your men have already seen the answer with their own eyes. What they've experienced in 24 hours has told them more about America's capacity than any propaganda. It's not just about food, it's about production, organization, and resources." Müller returned to his men, his thoughts in turmoil. As a history teacher, he understood the role of industrial might in warfare. The American Civil War, the Great War, ultimately, production capacity had proven decisive. He had accepted Goebbels' assurances that American industrial strength was exaggerated, that internal strife and inefficiency would undermine their war effort. Now first-hand evidence contradicted those claims. That afternoon, Captain Wilson received orders from command headquarters. "We're getting 200 more prisoners tomorrow, Sergeant. Italian this time, captured in northern Italy." Donovan checked the supply ledgers. "No problem, sir. We have sufficient rations for at least 2 weeks without resupply, and the next delivery is scheduled in 4 days. Processing teams ready?" "Yes, sir. Same protocol, delousing, medical, uniforms, mess hall." Wilson nodded with satisfaction. "Inform the kitchen. Let's make sure our German guests observe how easily we accommodate the new arrivals. Every detail reinforces the message." In the recreation yard, Carl Schmidt had organized a makeshift chess tournament using a set provided by the Red Cross. 20 prisoners gathered around, momentarily distracted from their situation by the ancient game of strategy. Josef Bauer watched Schmidt defeat a series of opponents. "You play well," he commented. Schmidt moved his bishop decisively. "My father taught me. He said chess develops strategic thinking, understanding your resources and your opponent's capabilities, recognizing when a position is hopeless." Feldwebel Wagner, listening nearby, frowned. "No position is hopeless while men have courage." Schmidt looked up. "Courage is essential, Feldwebel, but so is reality. The bravest knight cannot overcome a material disadvantage forever." That evening after dinner, beef stew, corn, fresh bread, apple cobbler, and coffee, Hauptmann Müller requested a private meeting with his officers. The Americans provided a room with the understanding that a guard would be present, but would not interfere unless security was threatened. Müller addressed his men gravely. "Gentlemen, we must address the situation realistically. We are prisoners of war. Our duty remains to maintain discipline, support morale, and uphold our oath." Lieutenant Richter spoke carefully. "Herr Hauptmann, the men are talking. They've seen enough to question what we've been told about American capabilities. Propaganda exists on both sides, Lieutenant. With respect, sir, this isn't propaganda. It's observable reality. The Americans are feeding 500 prisoners, the same rations their own soldiers receive. Tomorrow, they will add 200 more without apparent difficulty. Their supply system functions efficiently across thousands of kilometers." Oberleutnant Weber added, I've been observing their vehicle pool. New trucks, abundant fuel, spare parts. In my last 3 months with the Wehrmacht, I couldn't secure replacement tires for critical transport. Müller paced the small room. What are you suggesting? That we abandon hope? Not at all, sir, Richter replied. But perhaps we should prepare our men for a longer captivity than we initially indicated. The war's outcome may not be what we expected. Meanwhile, in the enlisted barracks, Carl Schmidt continued his documentation. His notebook now contained detailed records of meals, caloric content, and observations about camp operations. It had become a ledger of American abundance compared to German scarcity. Josef Bauer sat beside him. What will you do with these notes, Carl? Keep them as evidence. Of what? Schmidt paused, choosing his words carefully. Of the truth. Someday, when we return to Germany, people will ask what it was like. They'll want to know why we lost. These notes will help explain. Bauer lowered his voice. Do you think we'll lose, then? Schmidt closed his notebook. I think we already have. They just haven't told us yet. The next morning, as promised, 200 Italian prisoners arrived at Camp B. The Germans watched with interest as the new captives underwent the same processing they had experienced just 36 hours earlier. Hauptmann Müller observed the operation alongside Sergeant Donovan. Your system is efficient, Müller commented. We've had practice, Donovan replied. There are nearly 400 POWs Axis prisoners in America now. By year's end, the number will likely double. The figure stunned Müller. So many! How can you feed them all? American farms produced 134 million metric tons of grain last year. Captain, we exported 14 million tons to our allies while still maintaining domestic supply. Feeding prisoners isn't a strain. Müller tried to process these statistics. Germany's entire annual grain production before the war had been approximately 23 million tons. The disparity was staggering. At lunch, the Italian prisoners joined the Germans in the mess hall. The newcomers' reaction to American abundance mirrored what the Germans had experienced the previous day. Disbelief, followed by enthusiastic consumption. Carl Schmidt found himself seated across from an Italian sergeant named Paolo Ricci. Through broken German and hand gestures, they established communication. Food good, Ricci said, pointing to his plate. In Italy, no food 3 days before capture. Schmidt nodded. Similar for us. Where were you captured? North of Rome. American tanks, many tanks, too many to fight. We saw the same in Normandy. Their equipment never stopped coming. The two men, enemies of each other until recently, found common ground in their shared experience of American material superiority. By evening, the atmosphere in the German section of the camp had changed perceptibly. The rigid military bearing remained, but conversations had become more open, questions more direct. The arrival of Italian prisoners had provided further evidence of America's organizational capacity and resource abundance. At dinner, Captain Wilson invited Hauptmann Müller to join him in the officers' mess, a courtesy extended to senior prisoner officers. The meal was the same served to all prisoners, maintaining Geneva Convention requirements. Your men are adjusting well, Wilson observed. Müller nodded. They are disciplined soldiers. Adaptation is part of military training. True, but they're adapting to more than just captivity. They're reassessing their understanding of the war itself. Müller stiffened. My men remain loyal to their oath. No one questions their loyalty, Captain. But loyalty doesn't require blindness. These men have eyes. They can see America's industrial and agricultural might firsthand now. They can draw their own conclusions about what that means for Germany's prospects. Production capacity isn't everything in war. No, Wilson agreed, but it's a significant factor. In 1918, Germany didn't surrender because its soldiers lacked courage. It surrendered because it couldn't match Allied production. History repeats itself. Müller, the history teacher, couldn't refute this assessment. It aligned too closely with his own private conclusions. That night in the barracks, Carl Schmidt finalized his calculations. In just 36 hours, each prisoner had consumed approximately 500 calories, more than a German civilian received in a week. The camp's kitchen had absorbed 200 additional prisoners without any visible strain on resources or reduction in portion sizes. American guards and staff showed no signs of privation or rationing. Nearby, Josef Bauer was writing his first permitted letter home. "Should I tell them about the food?" he asked Schmidt. "Tell the truth, but carefully," Schmidt advised. "The censors will read it, and your family might face questions if you're too explicit. Perhaps say you are well-fed and healthy, rather than describing specific meals." Feldwebel Wagner, overhearing, approached them. The veteran soldier's demeanor had changed subtly. "Schmidt," he said quietly, "your calculations, are they accurate?" "Yes, Feldwebel. I've been precise. My civilian training as a baker included nutritional education." Wagner hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "My youngest son is 7. His last letter mentioned being hungry all the time. My wife wrote that school meals have been reduced again." He paused. "I told them victory would bring abundance." Schmidt met the older man's eyes. "Germany will need strong men to rebuild after the war. Feldwebel, men like you, men who understand reality and can face it." Wagner nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Hauptmann Müller couldn't sleep. Wilson's words echoed in his mind, aligning with his own observations and historical knowledge. As an educator, he had prided himself on intellectual honesty. Now, that same quality forced him to confront uncomfortable truths. He thought of his students in Munich, young men now fighting and dying for a cause that industrial math had already rendered hopeless. He thought of the propaganda he had accepted and repeated. He thought of the abundance surrounding him in this American prison camp and what it revealed about the war's inevitable conclusion. In the morning, Müller would face his men again. They would look to him for guidance, for reassurance about Germany's prospects. What could he tell them now that 3 meals had revealed more truth than years of Goebbels' speeches? The answer came to him slowly. His duty remained unchanged, to protect his men, to maintain their dignity and health. But now that duty included preparing them for a different future than they had anticipated. A future that began not with German victory, but with American pancakes and coffee. 48 hours after arriving at Camp B, 500 German prisoners gathered for breakfast. They formed orderly lines, received generous portions, and ate without the suspicion and hesitation of their first meal. They discussed work assignments, recreational activities, and educational opportunities provided by the camp. They made plans, formed friendships, and adjusted to their new reality. The war continued in Europe, but for these men, a different kind of transformation had occurred. In just 2 days, they had journeyed from hunger to abundance, from certainty to doubt, from propaganda to reality. Their bodies had begun to recover from malnutrition. Their minds had begun to process new information that contradicted long-held beliefs. And in this process, they had taken the first steps toward understanding not just their captivity, but the larger forces that had shaped the conflict and would determine its outcome. For Carl Schmidt, the baker's apprentice turned soldier, the evidence was in his notebook. Precise calculations of American abundance that contradicted every claim about Allied weakness. For Josef Bauer, the young private, it was the simple joy of a full stomach after years of increasing privation. For Feldwebel Wagner, the veteran, it was the quiet acknowledgement that courage alone couldn't overcome material disadvantage. And for Hauptmann Müller, the history teacher, it was the recognition that industrial capacity, not ideology, would decide the war's outcome. The America they discovered was not the decadent, disorganized society described by Nazi propaganda, but an efficient, productive nation, capable of projecting power across oceans while feeding its enemies better than Germany could feed its workers. This revelation would spread as letters home passed through censors, as prisoners were transferred to other camps, as the war progressed toward its inevitable conclusion. In time, these 500 men would return to Germany, carrying with them not just memories of captivity, but first-hand knowledge of American capabilities. They would help rebuild their shattered nation with a clearer understanding of industrial reality and the importance of peace with former enemies. Their experience would become part of the foundation upon which a new Germany would rise. A Germany that would eventually stand not as an adversary, but as an ally of the United States. This transformation began not with grand pronouncements or ideological conversion, but with something as simple and profound as food. Pancakes and bacon, beef stew and fresh bread, chicken and chocolate pudding. In providing these basics to enemy prisoners, America had demonstrated not just compliance with the Geneva Convention, but the overwhelming productive capacity that would ultimately win the war. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.